and to use this space to please ask people, if at all, and I am not accusing anybody, but I'm saying if at all, by any chance, that any of these fires are being set deliberately, that we appeal to those persons to please stop, Mr. President.
And we all join with you in that appeal. And we wish you much better.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, today I have come to speak to two sets of Barbadians. One, the large mass of Barbadians who are genuinely concerned about the state of Barbados, generally concerned about development, generally have honest questions about how this government intends to steady the ship and to be able to respond to their pressing needs. Mr. President, this includes Barbadians who have honest, critical questions that they want answered, Mr. President. This government is not afraid, Mr. President, of critical questions. This government is not afraid to respond to the Barbadian public when they ask us and when they call us to account, Mr. President. We have in this honourable chamber heard that we are facing as a government, as a country, a period of uncertain times in which there is a hostile international environment, Mr. President. And citizens have a right, because they have entrusted us with the mandate to lead, to be able to call us to account. Mr. President, this is not the government that in the face of criticism said to the country, said to persons who were raising critical questions that they were enemies of the state. It was not this administration. In fact, if you look at the record of this administration, Mr. President, we have been the government that has put before this country the greatest pieces, the most pieces of legislation intended to address the issue of accountability and transparency in this island. Mr. President, it is this government that introduced the practice of bringing public officers to the well, to hold them accountable, to answer critical questions about the performance of their ministries. It is this government, Mr. President. It is this government, Mr. President, that introduced the Public Finance Management Act that was raised in here as our commitment to increasing accountability and transparency in government affairs. This government. So that for anybody to suggest that this government is afraid, does not want to answer, is not addressing the issues of accountability and transparency, it is a folly, Mr. President, and it is incorrect. Mr. President, it was this government that, unlike other administrations that have previously ignored the Auditor General report and let it pass, that provided a comprehensive response that can be found on the Parliament website to the Auditor General's report of 2021, Mr. President. This government, in which we made a commitment to face and fix the accounting deficiencies that were identified within that Auditor General report. It is this government, Mr. President, that brought integrity legislation that was defeated in this chamber, Mr. President. It was this government. It was this government, Mr. President, that brought anti-corruption legislation, Mr. President. This government. It is this government, Mr. President, that sought to change the rules for the Public Accounts Committee so that it could function by changing the rule that only the opposition leader could chair so that we could have a functioning Public Accounts Committee, and it was defeated, Mr. President, but in this chamber, but we got it. so that for people to wax political and philosophical about issues of governance and accountability as if this government is not at the forefront, Mr. President, again, it is a folly. I challenge any member of this chamber right now, and I will forfeit the remainder of my time on my feet, Mr. President. Any member of this chamber that can bring evidence to suggest that this government, that this administration has not brought before this country the greatest amount of legislation, the greatest amount of policy initiatives to ensure accountability and transparency. It is this government, Mr. President, under the leadership of our Prime Minister, that opened itself to the public in the context of Paris Speaks, and there was nobody, Mr. President, at the door checking passports. It was open to everyone, all and sundry. And anyone who will incline their hearts to wisdom and their ears to understanding, if they go back and check the records of that, will know that it was not a chorus singing Kumbaya, that citizens asked hard questions of public officials who had to turn up to make sure that they answered those questions, Mr. President. And again, I say that anyone who wants to challenge the record of this government when it comes to addressing the issues of accountability and transparency really and truly should do so honestly and fairly, Mr. President, because our record in this respect stands for itself, Mr. President. Mr. President, very often, when we speak the truth, Mr. President, we are accused of grandstanding, red washing, and using persuasive language, Mr. President. You know, we are in dismissiveness. But when others undertake philosophical meanderings, Mr. President, on governance, and when they talk about what cannot and cannot be talked about in this country, and when you talk about debt, is this and that. But when we speak the truth, when we bring facts, the leader of government business didn't bring fallacy, Mr. President. She didn't pull things out of the sky, Mr. President. She brought facts about the record of this government, lifting this country from the decades that it faced for devastation by the previous administration. What facts, Mr. President, on how we have turned this country around in the short space of time that we have had in 5 years. Facts. But then we are accused, again, of being pompous-setting, red washing, all sorts of things. But Mr. President, our record and the facts of our performance speaks for themselves. This government is about the people's business. It was this government that in the context of a COVID pandemic gave to this country the mantra, no retreat, no surrender. And Mr. President, I am in strident form this morning, not because, Mr. President, we are perfect, not because we are afraid of being held accountable, not because we do not recognize that there are things that have to be taken up and concluded and completed, but because, Mr. President, I am confident that the government in which I serve understands the development agenda, is intent on delivering on the development agenda, and still has a mantra of no retreat, no surrender. The other class of Barbadians, Mr. President, and I'll be very frank here, I have less patience, and I need to call on every ounce of my grace to deal with them, are people who I call the PWRs. These are people who want relevance. And people who want relevance, Mr. President, they use the public space to deliberately confuse, conflate, tell half-truths because they like the sound of their own voice. I juxtapose those, again, like I said, to the mass of Barbadians who will ask honest, critical, questions, and discussions. This group, people who want relevance, stand in a group of their own, Mr. President. Less patience and less grace for that group. Mr. President, these people add very little to the critical and honest debate because it is not within their self-interest in order to be able to do so. They are not about the development agenda of this country. They are about hearing their own voices, creating confusion, diverting people with spurious arguments, as opposed to focusing on the bigger agenda for this country, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I would suggest to them that they go to the Bible and read Proverbs, because Proverbs is a chapter within the Bible that encourages people to seek wisdom and understanding. And it speaks in a manner that is not flattering about people who rush in and use their tongues to create confusion, Mr. President, and then to bring about a situation of crisis unnecessarily. Please go and read Proverbs, especially chapter 6. Mr. President, in specific cases, I do want to say that I understand. I put my hand up in the air. I understand that those people who want relevance may find themselves in a hard situation. Certainly, I might reflect that if all of a sudden people who once had my position now start to build houses, I would understand, for instance, if people who was once leading the institution that I was leading all of a sudden, and those same people presided over silent years, and now all of a sudden they've found voice and are speaking here, there, and every way, that I might, feel a little bit, jammed into a corner and pressed to say things that I wouldn't ordinarily say, that I really and truly should know better. And in that situation, Mr. President, I can exercise a little bit of grace because I can understand the difficulty that you might be faced then with trying to make sure that you maintain relevance in the context of feeling threatened. But unfortunately, that is to the detriment of honest and fair debate. Mr. President, it is interesting for me to note, and for this chamber to note, that there was a publication in 2017 by the then leader of the opposition, in which he was reflecting on the notion of truth and governance in politics. And in that publication, at that time in 2017, the article was reflecting on the fact that currently in Barbados, at that time of publication, that there was cause to lament the state of governance. And in fact, the paper used the Auditor General report of 2015 to highlight how deficient the politics and those who held power at that particular time were at in the context of good governance and truth. And I want to say, Mr. President, that we have to be careful that when you move from one part and into the other part, that when you make that move, you become embedded in the muck and the mire of that part. And then you cannot then divorce yourself from the history and that muck and the mire and present yourself as smelling like a rose. And that therefore, when you treat to public issues and public discourse, then you also as well, in the context of fairness and honesty, must reflect on where you are, Mr. President. And that is the message I want to be able to give. And I would like to suggest that it may be useful, Mr. President, within that context, for some reflection to take place, particularly amongst those group of people who want relevance, that they should settle themselves, and I'll use a phrase that the Prime Minister has used, cease and settle, Mr. President, and have them wheel and come again. Because this public, Mr. President, as we have been told, is awaiting the much-touted era of new politics. We are awaiting to see the difference that was to be able to brought to bear on the opposition politics of this country. We are awaiting, as was indicated by this side, the alternatives. And Mr. President, I want to say that I'm personally disappointed because I was looking to see a full gamut of alternatives on the paper that would allow us to be able to scrutinize and examine and what the government was putting on the table versus what could possibly be put as alternatives. Nothing. Nothing. We have no idea of the vision, Mr. President. We have no idea of what will be done differently. What we have is spurious, I don't even know what to call them, questions and counting of taxes and these things, Mr. President. But I would like to suggest that the people of Barbados want more. They want more. And certainly, Mr. President, for those that like counting, I want to ask them to count a few things for me. Can they count, Mr. President, which administration has presided over the most consistent years of economic decline when in power in Barbados? I want them to count the number of downgrades that this administration came into power and found. Can they count the level of government debt that this government came into power and found? Can they count the thousands of persons who were summarily retrenched before 2018? Can they count the salary increases that were given between 2008 and 2018, Mr. President? Can they count that against the salary increase that was given by this government in 5 years, Mr. President? And then, Mr. President, ask them to count the number of Barbadians who benefited when this government, within almost weeks of coming into power, increased non-contributing pensions from $155 a week to $225 per week. Ask them to count that, Mr. President. And this was despite coming in to a government that was completely devastated, Mr. President. Despite, Mr. President, coming into a government at which the country was on its knees, Mr. President, we put people first, Mr. President. We put people first. It is this government that worked with the private sector not once, but twice to have a compact to keep the profit margins down. Who did that benefit, Mr. President? 46 Barbadians, Mr. President, people first, not people in red, not people in blue, but whether you had purple, whether it's green, Mr. President, Barbadians. And for the majority of those in the most vulnerable groups, Mr. President, people's first has always and will always continue to be the mantra of this Barbados Labour Party, of this government, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to also note that it was this government that in the midst of a pandemic introduced the business interruption benefit, which provided a grant of $3,000 to help entrepreneurs when they couldn't work in the context of the pandemic. It was this government, Mr. President, that introduced the Vulnerable Family Survival Program that provided, again, $600 a month support to the most vulnerable families. And that, Mr. President, that support continues till today. It was this government that even in the context of the poly-crisis that we were facing, Mr. President, that recapitalized the NIS to make sure that persons could have unemployment benefits, Mr. President, that they could continue to survive even in cases where employers had not paid up the contributions, Mr. President. This government, Mr. President. It was this government that introduced the NAS Deferral Employers Program, so that employers who were retaining more than 3/4 or 2/3 of their staff complement were able to defer the employer's contributions to the NAS. This government, Mr. President, that laid off workers could receive benefits for 6 months, and those on short weeks to receive 60% for the days that they were not working. We created a shield, Mr. President, around Barbadians. This government. Mr. President, I want to ask, can they count the fact that when we came into government, with every 68 cents and every dollar going to pay debt, which meant that we only had 32 cents left for schools and roads. And despite this, Mr. President, this government reinstated free university tuition so that we can have people, Barbadians, our children, back at universities. And they may not be able, Mr. President, to count that because they do not understand the nexus between education, lifting people out of poverty, well-being, and development. And that is why they may have missed it, Mr. President. But I ask them, in a moment of quiet reflection, perhaps in a come-to-Jesus moment, that they reflect and perhaps count again, Mr. President. The increase, Mr. President, this year that is being given in the personal income tax allowance for pensioners in this country, that will be increased from 40,000 to 45,000, Mr. President, who will that benefit? We are told that the budget didn't have anything for people. We are told that this government doesn't look after people. We were even told, Mr. President, we have to be careful that we are not introducing policies that only serve the ones who vote for us and not the whole of Barbados, Mr. President. Can you imagine this government with this record, Mr. President? The Scotland District project, Mr. President, who's it going to benefit, Mr. President? Barbadians. We're repairing roads that for years have been neglected. Not red, Mr. President. It will benefit Barbadians, Mr. President, and provide jobs, Mr. President. When this government, Mr. President, has made provision for people who cannot get a mortgage to enter into a 30-year rent-to-own arrangement, when in the context of Hope Inc., we are providing housing for persons who may not necessarily qualify for a mortgage, and then on top of that, creating empowerment by making sure they have access to renewable energy solutions on their rooftops that will then put more money back into their pocket. This government, Mr. President, is being accused of not putting people first, of only serving one class and one group of Mr. President, of Barbadians. Let us have a fair and sober debate. Let not people who need relevance, Mr. President, try to create confusion and distraction. Mr. President, like I said, no problem with honest criticism. No problem, Mr. President, and we can have a fair debate about what this government may or may not have achieved. But what we will not have a fair discussion about is the record of this government when it comes to addressing the needs of Barbadians. For anyone to suggest, Mr. President, that this government is not about the people's business is a dishonest discussion, Mr. President. It's a dishonest discussion, and people, particularly those that hold, in some sense, leadership positions, and even those, Mr. President, that maybe talk show hosts, should know better. Should know better. And if we're going to have a discussion,
President, I raise on a point of order.
Yes, Senator Dr. Hines.
I truly hope that my colleague, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight, is not impugning anything about my character in particular, because that would certainly be out of order.
Yes, indeed it would be. I'm sure that senators would want to clarify, but I'm sure that you're not impudent in proper motives on any member of this Senate.
I made no reference, Mr. President, either to this chamber. I spoke to those persons who are calling hosts, radio hosts, and I'm not aware that there's only one radio host. There's only one radio host on the
Mr.
calling.
President, I raise on a point of order because it is somewhat rich to impugn certain things about talk show hosts, as I have heard in this chamber throughout these debates, when there's only one person in here to whom they could refer. So I raise on a point of order, Mr. President. Obviously, I leave this to you, but I think it is disingenuous to impute. Well, ask the Honourable Senator what she said, because clearly we're not listening, Senator Nichols, but I'm not speaking to you, I'm speaking to the President. I raise on a point of order. Thank you.
I would caution Senator Dr. Monroe Knight that the Goodley Senator is indeed a talk show host, not the only one, but certainly in that context, you will not impute any improper motives to talk show hosts in general, at least by definition, any such imputation should include our honourable member who is not, by definition, capable of any improper motives as a member of the Honourable Senate.
Mr. President, I am so guided. I will therefore, I'm so guided and I withdraw that reference. And therefore, Mr. President.
They have it struck from the record.
Mr. President, thank you for that guidance. And I would suggest perhaps, Mr. President, that I will rephrase as I have withdrawn the statement to indicate that perhaps people who want relevance and who are in leadership positions should make sure that they engage in honest and fair discussions in those, including those who lead in public spaces, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to admit again that we have had, Mr. President, yes, to transition some workers. We have had to, unfortunately, release temporary workers and have sought to transition them. But again, as a demonstration of this government being about the public's business, Mr. President, we have not just released them and say bye, but we have sought to transition them through providing, one, opportunities for them to enter into available work opportunities within the public service, but also as well through providing training through the Construction Gateway program. And again, I challenge any member of this chamber to identify where a government, in the context of an exercise that it has had to, unfortunately, release workers, has sought to ensure that it holds the hands of those workers, to ensure that they are dealt with sensitively, Mr. President, and provided the level of opportunities for upward mobility, Mr. President, because we are taking, in many instances, some workers who have not had training in areas and providing that training, or they may have had training in one areas and providing opportunities for them to be trained in others so that they can get jobs, not only within the public service, but within the private sector as well. That is the record, Mr. President, of this government. And again, Mr. President, I am strident because we need to have fair and honest debate, Mr. President. Mr. President, when the residents of St. Lawrence Gap had a problem with the proposed redevelopment project of St. Lawrence that was to take place at St. Lawrence, Mr. President, what did we do? Two members of government met with the residents in a town hall meeting, and what did we do? Hold our hands up in the air, apologize, say we dealt with it incorrectly, and we will wheel and come again. So that when I ask people to wheel and come again, it is because, as a government, we also do it. We also are prepared to take a step back if some of the policies that we have are intended to implement may have adverse effects, and people within the society reach out and say, we want to have a dialogue, there has not been, Mr. President, opportunity where we have not met them to have that discussion. And I'm aware now that there is some issues in the context of Spicetown, and I am assured I have not even spoken to my colleague, the Honourable Colin Jordan, because I know that the Honourable Minister will be meeting with those residents in order to be able to address their concerns. And I know that because it is the very posture of this government, Mr. President. The very posture of this government is one where we will meet and be about the people's business, Mr. President. Mr. President, but perhaps, to be very honest, I am being a little bit optimistic in terms of the maturity and the call for fairness of such people who need relevance, feel that their backs are against the wall, and therefore they need to make sure that they continue to make spurless comments in relation to the government's performance. Because very often, Mr. President, when there is a new thing that is being done, people are not always able to perceive it up front. We can become so locked into the traditional frame that when something new is presented, that when transformation is afoot, we are not always able to perceive this thing. Yesterday, Senator Malalou talked about the fact that really and truly his listening of the presentation of the estimates annually would reverberate into blah, blah, blah taxes, blah, blah, blah taxes. It demonstrated the fact that you get locked into a traditional nuance where you hear the repetition, and therefore, when something new and different is afoot, if you are not careful, if you are not, like I said before, making sure that you are attending to proverbs and seeking wisdom and understanding, you may not always be able to perceive it, Mr. President. Mr. President, transformation or metamorphosis does mean doing something in a new way. It does mean that, in some senses, we have to put down what we understand, what we think the thing should look like, and how it should function in order to appreciate a new way of doing things. Certainly, Mr. President, when I was a student at University of the West Indies, and particularly studying political science and political economy, one of the things that we often used to say is that governments would tinker with social change. They never tried to attend to the real structural transformation that was necessary because that was hard, yeah? That the 5-year election cycle very often prevented political parties and governments from attending to the real hard and transformative elements because it would fall outside of the election cycle. And that it was one of the weaknesses of representative democracies, and certainly in the context of small economies, that flaw of not wanting to address those transformative elements, Mr. President. And I can understand, Mr. President, because transformation is hard. It takes a long time. It requires, I believe, as we heard before in this chamber, a call for a significant cultural change and shift, Mr. President. And investing in that significant cultural shift, Mr. President, can be extremely daunting. But this government, in the context of who this government is, Mr. President, has presented Barbados with a transformative agenda. That transformative agenda, Mr. President, was crystallized in the context of the Appropriations Act. And I say it was crystallized because very often we believe that that presentation stands on its own, that it has no connection with ongoing policies, no connection with ongoing legislation, no connection with programs that are being done and are already in train, Mr. President. The transformative agenda that was presented was a crystallization of elements that this government has been presenting to this country for some time now. But often, like I said, Mr. President, we don't often perceive it when it is presented anew. Mr. President, it was indicated in this chamber, I believe, by Senator Dr. Christina Hines-Harris that, Hines, apologies, that the government is appearing to do quite a bit. It's doing quite a lot. And Mr. President, that could very well be true, because we have had to focus on three things. We have had to focus, one, on delivering on the things that we promised that we would deliver on our agenda. But we've also had to focus on repairing the damage that was done by the former administration. And then thirdly, we've also had to focus on contending with the multiple crises that have faced us. And in that context, it is not possible for us, Mr. President, to only advance in one area without making sure that we advance and take care of all three things at the same time. So yes, the government is doing a lot, but we're doing a lot because we have been forced to, Mr. President. We would have loved to be able to come in and be a government that had a level playing field. That was not what we found, Mr. President. We came in, Mr. President, as I detailed before, not going back there, but also as well facing a climate crisis, Mr. President, and we've had to address that as well. And therefore, the pillars of transformation that this government is presenting is intended, Mr. President, to address those fundamental things: the delivery, the repair, and the addressing of current context. And that there is a clear understanding, Mr. President, in the context of that transformative agenda, that it doesn't happen in a linear fashion, that at the same time that we address transformation, that we have to address repair, that we have to be able to consolidate. But we cannot, Mr. President, run away from the fact that given the context that we are in, that we have to transform. I want to suggest, Mr. President, that if we do not rise to this challenge as a government, then we would have betrayed a generation and missed a particular moment of time that we are in. And therefore, this government, Mr. President, is committed to that transformational agenda, even though we recognize that it is indeed long-term. Even though we recognize that it may not pay off benefits until some long time in the future, it is a commitment to transformation, Mr. President, that we are making. Mr. President, that transformation agenda is built on a number of pillars, and I want to go through some of those pillars, Mr. President. That first pillar, Mr. President, that I want to speak to is in the context of the international environment. And that is important, because how we address and deal with and have to face the issues of debt, have to face the issues of financing for development, are intricately tied to how we are inserted into the international arena. And therefore, we cannot deal with the issue of transformation only at the local level. We have to deal with the issue of transformation at the international level, because that significantly impacts our operations here. The main plank that we have been doing that is coalescing around what has become to be known as the Bridgetown Agenda. And I say coalescing, Mr. President, because those strands have been there previously, but we're now coalescing it under the umbrella of the Bridgetown Agenda. Again, people who, unfortunately, may not fully understand the new thing that is being done would want to suggest that this has been about travel, that this has been about pretty speeches, that this has been about grandstanding. What the Bridgetown Agenda is doing, Mr. President, philosophically, Mr. President, is calling for structural reforms of the international financial institutions. It is calling for structural reforms of the modern Bretton Woods institutions. It is calling for a reform in the way that financing is made available. It's calling for reform in the way that debt is approached, Mr. President. That is what the Bridgetown Agenda is. Those institutions, Mr. President, that have the power of rule-making, Mr. President, are not here in Barbados. They're not in the region. And therefore, the fight has to be brought to them, Mr. President. And that is why, Mr. President, the advocacy that has been ongoing in relation to the Bridgetown Agenda. And it is about that structural reform. And like I said before, if we are able, Mr. President, to have that level of structural reform, it means then that we can deal better with the issues of how we finance our development. It means, Mr. President, that we can address how we intend to finance all of the challenges that we will face in the context of climate change and building resilience. Mr. President, it was not an accident that we have the Resilience and Sustainability Fund of the IMF. It's not an accident. It emerged, Mr. President, out of that transformative agenda in the context of the Bridgetown Agenda, in the context of that call for structural reform at the international level to make space for small economies, Mr. President, to be able to get capital, to be able to get financing, and essentially to reframe the way that developing countries such as us that have been denied access to concessional financing, that we reframe that narrative that has been put abroad. That, Mr. President, is one of the critical pillars of the transformative agenda that this government is doing. So that is one. The other transformative agenda, Mr. President, and we come now locally, is built on 3 pillars, Mr. President. Pillar 1, the setting of overarching targets which focuses the nation and critically the public sector on key missions and targets. And this is a question, Mr. President, have been asked here. What is it that we are doing? What is the rationale? Do we have a goal in mind? What are the critical outputs that this government is going to be able to deliver? Pillar 1, Mr. President, I'll go in depth. Pillar 2 is the establishment of real and deep public service transformation, which will redefine the way how the public service works. Pillar 3, addressing the issue of cultural identity through direct interventions, because we understand that we have to address the issue of culture change. And Pillar 4, training as part of the transformative agenda. So those 4 pillars, Mr. President, and I want to go through them. So that Pillar 1 the setting of overarching targets which focuses the nation and critically the public service on key missions and targets. And three things, Mr. President, I want to say. Throughout this year, the government has been in dialogue, talking to the public service, talking through the social partnership on what are the defining missions that we will set our eyes and focus this nation on achieving together. Not government-defined missions, Mr. President, but in the context of the social partnership, national missions that will focus us all, that the private sector will agree that they will focus on, that government will agree that they will focus on, that Labour will agree that they will focus on. And the establishment then of those missions is intended then to make sure that the work of the public service is galvanized around those missions and the accomplishment, the achievement of those specific missions, Mr. President. So that will provide the overarching frame for how this government will execute its work. We then add to that, Mr. President, resilience targets, because while we may have that overarching frame, given our climate vulnerability, we also understand that it must be layered by a clear understanding of what are the critical areas of vulnerability and how then we have to be able to focus the government in order to make sure that we also achieve those targets, Mr. President. We've been asked, what is the overarching frame? We've been asked, what are the outputs, Mr. President? We've been asked where we are going. And Mr. President, I also want to say that one of the reasons where we haven't necessarily elucidated what those specific missions are is because it is part of an ongoing conversation that we want to have through the social partnership and with this country, because it is intended to be an all-of-country approach. So we have mission-focused economy, we have resilience targets, and then we layer that now with the commitment for results, Mr. President. Those three things. And I've spoken before about the commitment for results, and if we look in the estimates, you would see in the context of Head 13, Prime Minister's Office, under 040, provision in there for the commitment for results department, providing for staffing and providing for the building out of a portal for us then to be able to streamline our processes. And Mr. President, I'll be honest, because Mr. President, unlike others, I will always have the honest and fair discussion. We would have wanted, Mr. President, to be at the start of this financial year to have fully rolled out the CFRs. But again, like I said, as a government, we're always willing to wheel and come again. And we did so because as we step back and realize that we have to identify those overarching missions, that we have to identify those resilience targets, that we need to do that first, so that as we align ministries and agencies and departments of government, that we have a straight trajectory from the missions and the targets to the CFRs, which operate at the granular level in ministries. Because if we did not do that, Mr. President, we would have had each ministry, each agency and department coming up with their own CFRs, their own individual goals. But no, Mr. President, as we have stepped back, we are now creating a process in which those CFRs will be guided by overarching and agreed national missions and targets, Mr. President. We then, Mr. President, further undergird that process by the establishment of a number of institutional frameworks, Mr. President. I'm taking time to go through this in a level of detail so that we can understand the transformative agenda that this government is on. They will be supported, Mr. President, by the institutional frameworks of the National Strategic Council that will operate to bring members of government, including senior public servants and ministers, the Deputy Prime Minister, senior ministers, everybody together in one place, because as yet within the public service, that does not exist. The National Strategic Council. We will then have the Fiscal Council, Mr. President, to make sure that those mission-critical things that have to do with growth will be carefully monitored and attended to in the context of the Fiscal Council. We then have, Mr. President, the Growth Council as well, and that is private sector led, Mr. President. And then underneath that as well, you would have Barbados Delivers, which is a private sector initiative for Barbados Delivers to attend to making sure that we get our doing business metrics correct, Mr. President. So that we are not just at the philosophical, the operational level, but we are undergirded at the institutional level. All of the processes that will be needed, working in tandem with the critical partners and bringing them to the table to ensure that the transformational agenda works and is on stream. Mr. President, I have much more, but in the time that I have left, I want to touch on the other pillar of that transformational agenda, very briefly, which has to do the establishment of real and deep public sector transformation, Mr. President, and that is a process that is ongoing. Mr. President, we are in the process of digitizing the records across government so that very soon we will not be in the era of having to be passing files. We will be digitalizing government processes, and that has started. We saw the commendation of what is happening in the immigration department already. What is happening in the context, Mr. President, of facilitating payments for various departments online. That is part of the process of the public sector transformation, Mr. President. Mr. President, the issue of cultural identity through direct interventions. And again, if you look under Head 17, Subprogram 276 for the Division of Culture, you would see that in the context of the National Cultural Foundation, we will be establishing landship dots throughout this country. Mr. President, I want to identify the 100-voice choir that brings together chorales from right throughout this community. The training in stilt walking, basketry, photography, filmmaking that will be happening in the context of the ministry. I also want to identify, Mr. President, that we will be this year inscribing under UNESCO table tennis and the landship as intangible cultural heritage projects of this country. So that it means that globally, landship and road tennis will be officially recognized as part of our intangible cultural heritage, Mr. President. We are about the people's business. The final pillar, Mr. President, as my time gives way, unfortunately, Mr. President, has to do with that of training. We've spoken here before about the initiatives of the National Transformation Agency, NTI, and the fact that under that initiative, in the context of the BEST program, we were able to train thousands of tourism workers, in order for them to be able to upskill. And Mr. President, I want to be able to make sure that I give some figures in the time. We were able generally, Mr. President, to train over 15,000 workers and an estimated 32,000 workers in tourism-related jobs, Mr. President. 230 persons were trained under BIMAP and concluded courses in tourism and human resource management. SJPI, 130 persons trained in photovoltaic installation, new areas, Mr. President. Electric vehicle maintenance fundamentals, photovoltaic installation, photovoltaic electrical installation, Mr. President. 340 persons completed room attendant, middle and house management through the Rosette International Butler School. We had 132 persons trained from the tourism sector in accommodation fundamentals. At the Barbados Community College, 470 persons completed foreign languages, Mr. President, and I could go on and on and on. In the context of Coursera, Mr. President, we have 31,160 persons that have been enrolled for training programs. Over 95,000 lessons have been taken, Mr. President, free to Barbadians on a platform that attracts 12-year-olds and 74-year-olds, Mr. President. We have students that are at CXC level, Mr. President, that are taking 4 courses in there and speaking to the fact, Mr. President, that they have helped them tremendously in terms of preparation, Mr. President, for their studies. Mr. President, as I close, I want us to remember three things. 1, transformation. It's difficult, it's long, and it is hard. But this government intends to be intentional in its delivery of the transformative agenda for Barbados. That's number 1. Number 2, this government will not shy away from constructive engagement of its citizens because we understand fundamentally that we cannot deliver transformation and development unless we take our citizens along. And thirdly, Mr. President, this government stands by its strong record, Mr. President, of being accountable and transparent for what it intends to deliver, Mr. President, and what it is doing. This government stands by that mantra: no retreat, no surrender. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Senator, Mr. Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this morning I rose early and I thought that I would test my future. So I went up to St. John and I walked past and stood up in front of a beehive. I have a hive of bees that are very aggressive and they did not attack me. So I left my bee suit at home today. So, based on that prediction, Mr. President, I stand to say what I have to say as an independent senator. Mr. President, this 166 square miles that we have of land space is all that we have. There have been discussions and talk of increasing it by reclamation of land and building islands. And what I can say is that we know what we have now, but we do not know what we will get when it's done. But all the plans for development and growth, Mr. President, are predicated on a number of things, which include having money, among other things. But the single most important factor that influences development is access to water. Water. Now, we are at the crossroads, I believe, of something big. We will either take off and fly to the heights, or we will crash. And what might bring us down, Mr. President, is water. There is no question that climate change is real. If you had any doubt and you watched the news early this morning, you will see what's happening in California. And it will remind us all that do not think that what you have today will be the same tomorrow. And we are a little island state that has limited water reserves, and we are listed on the UN Index of as being significantly water scarce. Now, Mr. President, within the debate, we heard about the planned developments that will, if these buildings are built and they are occupied, will significantly increase the demand for potable water in this country. And potable water is a major issue. But water rights and the conservation of water is a public issue. It's not a government issue only. It's an issue for every citizen of the country, and visitors too. Because when we earn our tourist dollars, I presume, and I know that all the tourists leave things behind, and we have to deal with it, and most of it is water. But he who owns the water truly controls the country. And we are at a funny crossroads, Mr. President, where the institution that was responsible for the production and the distribution of potable water has largely become a retailer of water. I will repeat that. The institution that traditionally, 30 years ago, was responsible for the production and the sale of potable water has largely become a retailer of water. The institution buys its water from various entities. Now, in a small country as ours, Mr. President, the people, I'm of the view that water is an asset and it has strategic importance. And if we lose control of our water, we will suffer significantly. Now, we've seen in recent times in the press, persons complain that the supplies of water have been turned off for various reasons, and I'm not about to debate whether they are justified or not. But suffice it to say, if you cannot pay for the water you get in, you are likely to lose access to it. So the price of water, Mr. President, and one's ability to pay for it at the point where you receive it is significantly influenced by the arrangements made from the primary producer. Now, various governments have spent large sums of money to protect the supply of potable water in this country. It is not limited to this administration, but previous administrations, including the last one. We have seen the establishment of a desalination plant. We have seen a water augmentation project in St. Philip that has significantly improved the reliability and the supply of water to the persons living in St. John and in St. Joseph. I think it was, well, I don't remember who it was. One of my fellow senators pointed out that there's something special about being able to have a bath every day, and it's true. But the debt incurred by doing these things will be paid for by our grandchildren and possibly our great-grandchildren. But if the cost of water keeps spiraling, we will be further down the tunnel, Mr. President. And I've asked whether we need to relook at how we negotiate the cost of production of water. 70% plus of the cost of production is energy. We relied before on fossil fuel. We didn't have a lot of control over the cost of fossil fuel. But now we are producing green energy, Mr. President. And if we're able to produce the energy required to produce the water at a cheaper rate, then it should be reflected in the cost of water. I have gone to look at and have seen the incredible infrastructure in St. Philip, and I'm told that the photovoltaic plant adjacent to the water augmentation project produces 200% of the daily energy requirement of that project. But I dare say the cost of the water sold by that project has not changed. And I understand perfectly well that's an investment, and investors have to make profits. But if this country is going to grow, we cannot continue to pay for water at rates that could be lower. So we have to consider from the outset where we will get our energy from for these projects and how it will affect the end product. Mr. President, the reality is that he who owns the water owns the country. Now, it is interesting that there is lots of debate about what needs to happen in our state-owned enterprises. And there's been no details that I've heard about how they'll be dealt with. But Mr. President, if the day comes when the BWA as an SOE is going to be reorganized, and that important asset is going to be privatized, I would like to think that all Barbadians should be able to own a share of the features in that asset.
Mr. President, I rise on a point of order. I believe the honourable member, although quite unintentionally, is misleading the House. I believe that public statements have been made by the Honourable Prime Minister on more than one occasion that there is absolutely no way that the government of Barbados, this government of Barbados, would agree to the privatization of the state's resources relating to water. And she was specific to the Barbados Water Authority. And so I would not wish there to be a public statement going out there that then grabs a headline, BWA to be privatized.
Senator Miller.
Mr. President, I did not say in any way that there's an intention to privatize water. But Mr. President, I began by saying that the organization has moved from a producer and distributor to a net retailer. So if I used to make bread and sell it, and instead I buy my bread from someone else and then sell it, well, what am I? Have I changed my status? And if you look at what is happening in the country and the plans for water supplies, with the plans to have further desalination plants, then we are moving in that direction, no matter what we call it. That is my view, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, the BWA is owed approximately $100 million for its services in supplying water. And there was a warm debate, I think it was on Monday, and the name of was mentioned about the Ombudsman and the Auditor General. But there was an ad in a public notice, in fact, in the newspaper, I think it was on Monday, advertising for an external auditor for the said BWA. That suggests to me that there are issues within the BWA. And we know, Mr. President, and I've had personal experience of this.
Mr. President, on the order. Yes, thank you. Mr. President, the indication of an external auditor does not indicate that there are issues. Government offices, private sector agencies are audited on a regular basis as part of the normal business practice, Mr. President, to ensure that the affairs are able to be in order, to make sure that the reports are submitted, etc. And it is not, Mr. President, a good indication. And the Public Finance Management Act requires it, the same act that we were accused of not following, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Millard.
I fought behind Mr. President. Wonderful. Mr. President, the BWA is unlikely. One would ask, if all is well, how will it collect its 100 million? Mr. President, I have a water meter at the house that I live at, and I live at the end of a line. And whenever the water goes off and it comes back on, my meter and my bill reflects 100% increase in use. And it means, therefore, to my mind, that it's recording something other than water. It's recording air. So we have, Mr. President, a system of charging customers, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, for water, but the devices used to measure the water appear to measure something other than water. There's no need for anyone to rise because this administration is not responsible for them. Mr. President, it is a big future problem because the truth is the organization might know what it is producing, but it does not really know what it is selling if the meters are faulty. It means, therefore, that it really doesn't know what it's owed, and it really can't see how much it will collect. So water is a massive, massive problem, Mr. President. Now, successive governments have tried to deal with our problems of leakage and the water that is pumped and the large volumes that are lost in the bad pipes. But successive administrations have failed to deal with educating the public about water conservation. And the answer can't be produce more, produce more, produce more, because production costs money. There is a town planning requirement, and I think the threshold is 1,350 square feet of floor space. If a house has that square footage, one is required to have a cistern. But it has not been adequate education of the public about the use of the water in such cisterns. And there's not been any legal framework set up for use of green plumbing. So, as far as I'm aware, one cannot legally connect your tank to your plumbing system in your house. As far as I'm aware. Maybe someone will rise and advise me otherwise. So, Mr. President, if the planned developments that we have are to happen and our demand for water goes up, will we be able to meet it at reasonable costs? And if the costs are higher than they are now, where will we find ourselves? So there seems to be a need to have significant public education, Mr. President. Public education about water conservation, starting probably in preschool. Enough said about water, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to touch very briefly on energy. I have noticed, Mr. President, that the roofs of the government industrial parks, 4 of them, Harbour, Rosettes, Newton, and 6 Roads, and Newton, not so much. The largest collections of government roofs in 4 spaces, excluding schools, are being covered with photovoltaic cells. I wish and I hope that this is a government project, Mr. President, that will earn income for the government and the people of this country. Because roof space, Mr. President, roof space in that volume, Mr. President, is a national asset. The government does not have any buildings, Mr. President, in such numbers, in such compact spaces, that can produce so much energy and influence the grid. And I hope it's not a case again, Mr. President, of he who owns the water and also owns the energy is king. Mr. President, I have not had, and we've not been privy in this chamber to any legislation to deal with the disposal of the byproducts of all the green energy. And we are well into the program. And every week and day we import batteries and photovoltaic cells and cars, and we are not speaking about disposal. And we appear not to have made any special provisions for disposal. And we are but a rock in the ocean, and we depend on the water on the ground. And if you don't provide safe disposal, the people will find their own places to dispose. And it will affect us all. So I call on the government and the relevant ministers to please start the movement, Mr. President, to provide safe space for disposal of the end-of-life products. Some time ago, I think it was Senator Malalu, spoke about disposal of the fossil fuel cars and trucks and vehicles. And there's really been no debate or provision for that either, any new ones, because if we have set a date for the transition, then one would assume that there will be a rush at some point in time for disposal, and we've not made any provisions for it. So I hope that somewhere these plans are being hatched and are at an advanced stage, and we will soon see them. Lastly, in that trend, Mr. President, recreation. Mr. President, when Gabby said, "That beach is mine." He was right. And we all know that song. There has been, Mr. President, a constant wish by all types of persons to have private beaches. It's the ultimate asset. Far exceeds having the most expensive car or most expensive house. To have a private beach in Barbados is probably the height of ownership of anything. Mr. President, the right to access the beach cannot only be for persons who walk. We make lots of representation on behalf of the disabled, who I believe should have equal rights of access. And one should not expect a disabled person to park one's car and have to push your wheelchair or be carried 500-600 yards down the hill to get to the beach. You should be able to drive your special needs car or be transported there and get off in a reasonable distance in a safe parking area and go to the beach. I mention that because, Mr. President, not far from here, there's now been a gate installed on a road that led to a beach. Probably one of the most unspoiled beaches in Barbados. And I hope that the relevant government authorities will look into it, and if it has been illegally installed, they shall remove it. I will leave that matter there, Mr. President. It is timely, Mr. President, that the Minister of Health has turned up. I welcome him. Mr. President, we have a hospital, a tertiary care hospital, that is everybody's football. People seem to get up in the mornings looking to kick it, and they go to bed doing the same thing. But it's the only tertiary care hospital that we have at this point in time. And the government has made tremendous effort in the difficult times to fund the hospital and come up with some clever ways of providing that funding, including the health levy, which provides about $65 million a year. So the notion that public health care is free is at least a joke. There's $65 million spent directly on the QEH that's collected through the NIS. Now, there are a number of small hospitals, Mr. President, and I'm sure that in the future there'll be others. And as more Barbadians choose to seek private care and pay out their pockets, governments might find ways to ease the burden on the people indirectly by providing concessions to the hospitals. But, Mr. President, the concessions have to be even and fair. And it would seem unreasonable that a hospital might have disposables and drugs duty-free and VAT-free, and another hospital operating in the same sphere has to pay for theirs. It means that you're disadvantaging some of the patients, Mr. President. And if indeed Barbadians choose to have private care of their own pockets or through insurance, and government wishes to encourage it, then the concessions, Mr. President, should be evenly handed out across the board. Now, Mr. President, I want to make a few comments about my beloved QEH. And I say that without any sarcasm. It's Senator Walker's too. Now, in October 2019, Mr. President, we came to this chamber and amended the QEH Act. And I spoke with the mantra that there was no right time to do the wrong thing. I have not changed it. Mr. President, Senator Monroe Knight gave me a wonderful reminder just now when she said, we should recall what happened in St. Lawrence. And maybe the time has come, Mr. President, for similar action in our institution. An experiment is only an experiment. And you have to accept when it isn't working and be willing to change it. And maybe the time has come. But Mr. President, a hospital can only be assessed by one thing, not what it costs to run it, or how much money it makes, or how much money it loses, but it's assessed by patient outcomes. So, if you spend money, you look at the outcomes and see what they are, and if you spend more, the expectation is, unless somebody's stealing it, you should have better outcomes. And one therefore has to ask whether with all the money that is being spent in various areas of the QEH, whether there is truly any assessment of outcomes. Not just talk, but assessments. Whether the waiting lists are genuinely getting shorter, whether productivity is genuinely increasing. Not whether people are coming to work for longer periods of time or less, but real numbers, facts and figures. Now, Mr. President, this administration or government, in the most difficult of times, found $11 million to spend on the accident and emergency department to expand it. It was a promise made in the manifesto. I think I did read that manifesto. It was a promise made and it was a promise kept. But sometimes, Mr. President, we make a promise, you have to go back and say, I know I promised you that, but I haven't looked at it properly and it really doesn't make sense. I want to modify it. It was a bad idea. It was a bad idea, Mr. President, because, excuse me, Mr. President, if you did not fix the problems of flow within the hospital, you would have created, thank you, a larger, spacious, more comfortable A&E for people to wait in for longer times and have worse outcomes. Mr. President, it saddens me to admit that it has come to pass. But I said it was going to happen. You cannot take a person who has problems with movement of the intestines and just give them new dentures and more food. You have to fix the problem. And the problems in the QH that relate to flow have not been addressed. And if they have been addressed, Mr. President, they have not changed. But leadership, Mr. President, leadership is important. And Mr. President, if you have 2,000 plus people under one roof and you do not have the right leadership, you have problems. And the people who you treat will have problems, worse problems, Mr. President. So I call on those in charge to stop the experiment, Mr. President, and make a change and fix it. It requires some hard, harsh decisions, Mr. President. I understand that, I accept it. It requires, Mr. President, that workers of all sorts, the lowest paid workers and the highest paid workers too, have to improve their productivity. Not just turn up to work, but improve their productivity. And they have to be assessed without fear. They have to be assessed without fear, Mr. President. I too expect the same from me because I'm employed by the QH. Mr. President, but the people who lead, and while you may have a pyramid, there are different grades of leadership. But those who lead have to lead. So if I may revert to the A&E, the A&E was supposed to have been expanded and had its size increased, and the project was supposed to have been finished, and the people of this country were supposed to be treated in a better facility and more efficiently. One can question whether it's a better facility, but it's certainly not being more efficient. Some will argue it is worse. There's no easy fix, but it requires, Mr. President, a hard, harsh, dispassionate look. And somebody has to do the right thing, Mr. President, and find new leadership, and implement new leadership. Because the people call for it and the people want it. And the mantra, a promise made, promise kept, is supposed to be real. Now, there is supposed to be another $5.2 million to be spent on completing the refurbishment of the A&E. That will complete the refurbishment of the physical plant. I do not know if it includes repairing the broken parts of the new plant. But the question is, Mr. President, will it improve function? Because an accident emergency department is more than just a physical space. And the only people who suffer are those who either cannot pay or cannot go anywhere else because they're too ill. So we have to fix it, Mr. President. I feel like I'm repeating the same thing over and over. I must check your hands, sir. Like I get the feeling I've said everything that I'm saying here before. No, I'm not psychotic. I've had an assessment. I'm not psychotic. I have a good memory. I have a good memory. And there are things I can say, but I will not say it. Mr. President, I want to point out, however, that the budget given for the A&E department by the then minister has now been increased by 50%. Give or take a couple $100,000. That's amazing that you've had to increase the budget for a project by 50% in a tertiary care institution, and you still can't deliver. Something is really wrong. you spent $11 million. You built an annex with $11 million, couldn't finish the project. You're going to spend another 5.2 and complete the renovation. But things are worse than they were before. So how will we get them better? I don't know the details of how we get them better, Mr. President. But we need change. We need change, Mr. President. We have to fix it. I'm sure that the minister that I support will bring change. I'm sure he will. He has a lot of support. But the people need to change. Because as a boy, I remember an election, I think it was 1976, and the party in power, 76 I think it was, had this slogan that said, "How long is too long if it's good?" But they lost, Mr. President. It wasn't that. They didn't realize that it was not good, but it was 76. It wasn't 76. What year was it? Yes. Yes, it was 76. Said, how long is too long if it's good? But the public showed that it was not good.
It was not good.
Dr. Walcott is fond of accusing me of different allegiances. Mr. President, I believe my beloved QH behind. I'm sure that Senator Walcott, the Minister of Health, will make the appropriate changes so that as he approaches the end of his political career, he can look back. I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that he's the end of his career. I'm not at all saying that as he approaches it, because he's not as young as he used to be, neither am I. We can all look back, and Senator Thompson too, and see where it has gone from. Well, Senator Thompson, Mr. President, was the Minister of Health. So we can all look back as participants and see what we have done to move it along and how we've improved it. And Senator Walker sits in the chair. So I hope, Mr. President, that within a short time, there'll be changes in the QEH, which would resound to the benefit of all those being served. Now, I want to comment on the matter about cataract surgeries. Senator Haynes yesterday gave a wonderful, I will say, a wonderful contribution. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And there was a mention of cataract surgeries and the fact that we had accomplished the clearing of this stated backlog. I challenge that, Mr. President. I challenge that because every week I get calls from people who've dropped off the waiting list. So, you can reasonably say you've cleared the list of the people who were listed. But there are large numbers of persons in this country who are almost blind because they have cataracts. And while they may have gone for surgeries during COVID, they dropped off the map. They are no longer, they haven't been coming because they're terrified and for various reasons they didn't come. So we don't be lulled into a sense of security that we'll fix the problem. But it's a good achievement. But for the first time in a long time, the government has made sure that all of the inputs needed to do the surgeries were available. Human personnel, physical space, and, Mr. President, lenses, and all the other things. So I congratulate the government. It's a great achievement. And I stood in the Senate, Mr. President, last year, and I pleaded to help fix the knees of those Barbadians who were out there with creaky knees, and I'm glad to see the government has responded. So I congratulate them in public, Mr. President. I congratulate the government for restarting the joint program. And I hope that it will continue so that more Barbadians who need to have their joints done, who cannot afford to pay for them out of pocket, can have them done. So once again, I congratulate the government. Mr. President, the nurses in this country deserve to be recognized for what they do. And I don't mean just Barbadian nurses. I mean all nurses. The nurses who are Barbadians, who are Vincentians, who are Ghanaian, who are Cuban, because they do work, excuse me, that other people will not do and cannot do. And they do it with dedication. And I think, Mr. President, that the proposal or the decision to add nurses to the traveling schedule is a very good one. And I also think that the addition of specialist nurses, the 18 in number, is a positive thing. It could make some significant changes to public health care. But, Mr. President, people come and they go. And when you are a specialist, you are in demand. So I hope the government has a plan not to see these 18 nurses as an end point in a program, but the beginning of a continuum. And we will have more nurses trained as specialists, because the more you are trained, the greater you are in demand, and the better you'll be paid in many other places. Mr. President, our hospital sometimes is dysfunctional, not because the highest paid worker didn't come to work, or the next highest paid worker, but sometimes because the numbers of people who are probably the lesser paid workers have either not been hired in adequate numbers or have not turned up for work. So we have to make sure that the losses, the material losses that we incur every day, like in an operating room when you lose 4 hours out of 10 because you couldn't get a patient brought to the operating room because the person who gets paid a daily rate far less than the hourly rate in the operating room didn't come to work, it doesn't make sense. It would seem to make more sense to hire more of those people, even if the numbers were deemed to be excessive, and have them lame, as we have noticed with some public workers, so that you can call upon them, than have a facility that costs large sums of money per hour sit idle. That is one change, Mr. President, I think can be effected at lower cost, and it doesn't require any brilliance to fix it. Mr. President, the overall articulated plan for healthcare in this country in the public sector and with some stated plans for the private sector might mean that the demand for services in Barbados will go up, particularly if the health tourism aspect of it takes off. But one of the problems we are faced with, Mr. President, now are reliable sources of supplies. It is a major problem. It is not only a problem for us in Barbados, it's a problem worldwide. I thought I would mention that because sometimes it is hard to tell persons why you cannot do something when you have everything else, but you can't get the part, or the item, rather, that costs $200. And not because you don't have the $200, it's just it isn't available. And it might mean that, and I'll speak from the point of view of the hospital, because I think that the QH is still one of the largest consumers of most items used in medicine. Maybe we need to review our procurement strategy. Maybe the old style of sitting with suppliers and depending on the suppliers might not be the way to go in the future. We may need, Mr. President, to source a lot of our own supplies directly, and we might save large sums of money also, because there's no question that there's no endless supply of money. And if, Mr. President, at the end of the day, whatever we do improves patient outcomes, we, Mr. President, who, if we have not yet used the services, but we are sure as long as we're alive, we'll need them, we will be happy. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, I am grateful for the opportunity to participate in the debate on the appropriations bill this year. So I am also mindful of the fact that yesterday marked 1 year since I was appointed to this chamber. I was reminded of that, sir, by my daughter yesterday evening. And one of the things that I have learned to emulate in public life was that you take the good things that are worthy of emulation and you in yourselves amend that feature. I'm sure Senator Nurse understands what I'm speaking about. And the bad things you also try to cut out. And the leader of government business began this debate by referring to the late Professor Owen Arthur, who in his later years said to us that you have to begin to view the country and where it is going through the eyes of your children. And so I, in my second iteration in this honorable chamber, have to look at what we are doing as a government, as a people, and as a country, holistically, through the eyes of what would be there for our children. Because at the end of the day, I would not want my children to say that we participated in a reckless exercise or did not pay sufficient attention to the issues that really face us as a country. And so before I get into the reasons why I would support the appropriation bill for the financial year, I do want, sir, to thank Madam Deputy President for sharing with us in the parliamentary group the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report for 2023, because context is everything. Without context, you can never appreciate the full picture. And Barbados does not stand splendidly in isolation from many of the global risks that will impact the world in which we live over the next 2 years or in the next 10 years, which is what this report speaks to. And indeed, sir, I am happy to participate in the debate and support the Appropriations Bill, Upward, Onward, Beijing Excellence 2030. It is not a slogan, sir. It is a mission for this country to position itself over the next 7 years to be a leading developed state as a small island. It is not something beyond our reach. We are not going to be able to have large militaries, nuclear weapons, or what people consider to be the trappings of most developed societies. But we already, sir, as a small income developing state, have to deal with the challenges that developed countries deal with. And in the process of reforming and transforming the Barbadian economy, some of these challenges are not the ordinary challenges of the South. Some of these challenges, sir, are global challenges, as we speak about climate change and the risk that we all face every time we look at the hurricane season coming across the Atlantic and the storms and the potential damage that they're doing to many, many countries in this area of the world. So that context, sir, is everything. And in many ways, the imperative to position this country within the context of what is going on in the global environment has always been a lasting mission of this Barbados Labour Party. So when I joined the party in 1999, a lot of my friends and colleagues asked me, you don't, as a young professional, join a government in its dying days. I remember that. The leadership of this party and of the country, sir, challenged us not to settle for the bronze, challenged us to reach for the gold. I believe the enduring metaphor was at a time when a very skillful Barbadian athlete won a bronze medal at the Sydney Olympics. But at that time, the mission was to take this country forward, sir. And I draw the reference and contrast because Prime Minister Arthur was very fortunate in the sense that he sat in a parliament where all four prime ministers who preceded him ran governments in a parliament that he sat in before he became prime minister. And, sir, we look back at his vision to transform Barbados amidst the challenges of the day at the beginning of the new millennia, the rapid trade liberalization and globalization of the world economic circumstances, the removal of the planks of our development from independence, from under us, and the transformation that we have had to endure, sir. And I look back at the economy that he inherited, where there was 1/4 of the Barbadian population unemployed, sir. Our dollar was in peril. We had weeks of foreign reserves. So I remember being a student at the university in the early 1990s when a sugar truck turned over at the bottom of University Hill, and people from all over were running from the top to the bottom, all down Walmer Lodge to get the sugar that spilled on the highway because we could not even get sugar in Barbados then. And for our students, we were shamed because we're like, y'all producing sugar and that's how y'all behaving? We were importing sugar from Guatemala and Guyana. And we were ridiculed then, and we lived through it. I remember, sir, my late father came home and said to me and my brothers, boys, sweet life done. That is the economy that the Barbados Labour Party inherited in 1994. And I know too many people who are not able to remember that. But, sir, in making a conscious decision to join this party, I reflect on all of these, and I tell my children these stories. So all the economic indicators were pointing in the wrong direction. And we came to office then, sir, with a promise to provide jobs for our people. The taxation system in Barbados was reformed. And when the VAT was introduced, it was wrongly criticized as heavy taxation on the backs of the people. So even the most honorable, the mighty Gabby, won the Calypso Crown in about 1997. He sang Master Day Done, everybody knows that song, but he also sang a song, No Sympathy. You throw the VAT on we, no sympathy, only have mercy. How you expect we to survive the VAT, killing we alive, only after. By the time this economy turned the next year, and we began to see the transformation in the country's reserves, all of the work that was done to criticize the repositioning of Barbados and reforming the tax system to give us a revenue base that would not tax people's incomes, per se. All the benefits we saw, and we saw a surge in the economy. 8% was paid back. And this Barbados Labour Party administration, sir, made sure that we passed an amendment to the Constitution to prevent future governments from doing it. So much so that when we fast forward, I remember in the last administration, sir, the Minister of Finance, in what was termed the water cut budget, when he said he could not do anything but tax the people because the Barbados Labour Party in opposition refused to give the government of the day the constitutional support so that they could send home public workers. And the contrast has to be drawn, sir, because when the Barbados Labour Party came to office in 2018, everyone was saying you have to send home thousands of public workers in order to bring down the pressure on the dollar and to reduce the fiscal deficit that we had at the time. My good friend and client, former central bank governor, has made known his position on the large size of the public sector, putting pressure on the Barbadian dollar. And this government was faced with a problem, sir, a mighty challenge, and Senator Dr. Haynes carried us through that process. But a lot of people forget we were in a lonely channel, sir, when this country took the bold step to go into selective default on your international debt. Bold steps, sir. That saved this country. And we were able to mitigate and have the fiscal space to mitigate COVID and all of the other challenges that were thrown to us. So that, sir, I say context is everything. Because if there is an excessive amount of chirping on this side, in this honourable chamber during the debate, so I sympathize with my colleagues, and I might even be accused of leading the charge in the asides and the ad hominem account. So you don't hear any of those, I understand that. But you would understand and appreciate why it is that the members on this side take particular umbrage to all of the chirping out there. So we understand, Senator Paris, and I were here, sir, in the last appropriation bill in this chamber, when the leader of the opposition, who then became Prime Minister of Barbados, accused the government of taking Barbados too far ahead, too fast. Sat right there where Senator Dr. Hines sits. And I'm not accusing her of taking on the traditions of that seat. But there are some similarities which I will get to later when he spoke on the offshore taxation bill and those pieces of legislation which were moved in 2007. There's some similarities in some of the comments that they made. So it's either the seat or they think on the same place. But that is not the point I'm making, sir. We were criticized for building all the roads for World Cup. And I went to visit my mom who's not well, and she's in a home, sir. And I stopped by my good friend Barker, Senator Tyrone Barker, one of the longest serving senators in the history of this country from 1991 to 2008, unbroken, who's not himself doing well. I remember him speaking in the Appropriation Bill in 2007, but when the World Cup done, the roads are going to be here. When the World Cup is done, all the infrastructure to deal with the security apparatus, which people can't understand and begin to appreciate, which had to be put in place for Barbados to secure a bid for less the finals of a Cricket World Cup, which was held in major cities. And since we built Kensington Oval, we've had 2 other World Cup finals at that place, sir. We also had a World Cup in golf in early 2008. Talking about repositioning the Barbadian economy, sir, so that the Appropriation Bill and the speech given by the Honourable Prime Minister in the other place, that speaks to the transformation of the Barbadian economy by 2030, a 7-year mission, is something that let us not have any disagreement about where we need to go, because every one of us feels and believes in this country that we can aspire to and achieve a global standard of excellence as a small nation. And I think all and sundry would agree we can have disagreement about the means, we can have disagreement about the vehicles, but let us get on with the work of taking this country forward. Let us stop peeping behind ourselves and no one is frightened, sir, about the criticisms that come, especially on our side. But I have great sympathy for a robust defense of this government's economic management of the country. This Barbados Labour Party was accused, sir, of treating Barbados as an economy and not a society. Because when you couldn't criticize us about the economic fortunes of the country anymore, you had to find something to say. And sadly, sir, it must be said, Barbadians wanted change and they got change. You know, they got the change they wanted. And we had 10 glorious years, 10 glorious years, for which we are now recovering from the glory. And the people of Barbados fought once and they fought twice, because when they were reminded about the 10 glorious years, they came out and said, no, we can do it again. And we're hearing about dictatorships. Sir, it is hurtful to us because, sir, when I was a student attending the World University Debating Society Championships, everybody on their way to Athens was reading the Economist magazine because it had a good snapshot of all the issues and the potential topics for debate would be somewhere covered in those pages, Time magazine, Newsweek, and so forth. And coming from the Caribbean, sir, never heard about this magazine. I never, sir, missed picking up one in an airport since then. And sir, the World Ahead 2023, printed by the Economist magazine, for the first time, I may be wrong, has in a chapter or a article, a new way to fight climate change together, and a cartoon picture of our beloved Prime Minister. And it challenges the rest of the world to consider the Bridgetown Initiative. And the Bridgetown Initiative, sir, is not only dealing with climate, but it's dealing with debt. And how small countries like us that are vulnerable to climate disasters have to mitigate climate threats, but also have to deal with what Senator Dr. Haynes called the polycrises emerging after COVID. Particularly small countries. So this party, sir, is not, and this government is not afraid to deal with the issue of debt. But the superficial criticisms about the country has not dealt with the debt. is annoying, sir, for all the reasons that the members on this side had to speak and to remind the country. And we're not boasting, but we have to remind them, because I've heard one of the commentators out there, and I'm not speaking with anybody to make sure, I'm not speaking with anybody, any of the honourable chambers, was a chairman of the National Insurance Board, was a member and a director of the Central Bank Board. And every time they speak about the debt. When the Central Bank and the NIS was financing recurrent expenditure under the last administration and putting the national insurance funds in peril, and the Central Bank printing money to fund not development projects, but ordinary recurrent expenditure, we didn't hear anything about it. But we must now sit down and evaluate these constructive criticisms and analyses and critical content as if we are blind or forgetful. That is why there's chirping on this side. Because we understand when a government was indifferent to the issues that affected this country, when Barbados' voice in the international community went silent for 10 years, when Barbados' leadership of the region was absent for 10 years. We understood where we were going. And when our leader, Prime Minister Motley, spoke to any issue, she was told that she should be punished with laughter. Punished with laughter. This government had to come and clean up the issue with CLICO and the policyholders. And when a no confidence motion was raised to bring, when a matter of public importance was raised, Speaker refused then to give the voice of the people. I didn't hear anything about a threat to democracy then. I didn't hear anything about a government being indifferent then. Millions of people's dollars were at stake, gone down the drain. Not a word. So when the sanctimonious cries about the government overreaching and the government not listening and the government and all this comes down, we have to be chirping in here, sir. Have to be chirping. When we hear about corruption, and I heard, sir, in this debate that one of the reasons why people don't trust governments and politicians is because they don't participate in the process of budgeting. And I captured the headlines, that participatory budgeting is the way to go on. Sorry, when you check participatory budgeting, sir, I went and did a little bit of research, and I only started to scratch the surface. But seeing that scratching the surface is the way to operate in the political sphere in Barbados, you just go and say something, the press carries it, and then you become an expert on it. That's the way how things go in Barbados. I always say we don't have any journalists in Barbados, we got reporters. Because from the time the news starts to the time the news ends, is somebody went somewhere and said something. There's never any analysis of the content, but it's always that somebody said. And they would probably do that to me. You'll see tomorrow to whoever that said, Nicholas said X, Y, and Z. No analysis of content at all. But participatory budgeting is a municipal device used all over the world. Well, not all over, in some places in the world, sir, to deal with municipal expenditure. Not a national budgetary exercise, because a country cannot work if you were to create what Senator Dr. Maynard and I discuss and refine as a plebiscite, where we get everybody in to determine what the country can spend money on. No country in the world can work like that, sir. But we are hearing that there's a lack of trust, and that's why the people ain't going to vote, and all kinds of things are happening that are wrong, because everybody, we should perhaps carry on the estimates not in the well of Parliament. We should carry on the polling programs and let people decide where the money should be spent. And that is the contrast, sir, that we have to deal with when, on the one hand, Prime Minister Richie Sunak and President Emmanuel Macron, everybody knows what I mean. I am not pretending to call anybody's name correctly. are discussing, sir, the Bridgetown Initiative at their last bilateral summit. This is something that is the focus now of attention of leaders of two G7 powers, taking an initiative brokered here in Barbados by our beloved Prime Minister and taking it seriously. None of the professors who call into the program, because I call it the University of River Road, and there are millions and millions of economists, theories, millions and millions of legal theories, health theories, every theory are thought and discussed there, but that's an aside. But we don't hear anything about this initiative, sir. And, sir, when The Economist magazine, when the leaders of G7 countries in the world get together to speak about the Bridgetown Initiative, it is something that is worthy of note, sir. And we recognize, sir, that the emerging markets, small states like Barbados, we're all facing a number of crises coming out of the global pandemic. The cost of living crisis is not something that is unique to Barbados, sir. Every time you turn on television all over the world, there's an energy crisis being created, sir, as a result of the escalation of the war and the prolongation of that war in Ukraine. That's affecting global supply chains. That will affect cost of living in countries that are now trying to get their feet and come up with ways to deal with the fallout from the COVID-19 crisis. So there will be chirping on this side, sir, when we hear echoes of statements made by other people outside of the chamber about the government ain't doing nothing with debt. I'm disappointed in the budget because we haven't reformed this, we haven't reformed that, and that kind of chatter. Only designed, sir, to scratch the political surface of the argument, but never to get into any deeper discussion about the policy or create a perspective as to how you could join the debate at that level, sir, and to bring and add something to the debate. They will be chirping on this side when we hear echoes of those things, sir. These crises, sir, that we speak of are looming. Sir, the type of quantitative easing, as economists call it, that the large economies were able to do through COVID, we didn't have that capacity to do, sir. America, 25%, Britain, 19%, Japan, 16%, Germany, 15%, additional spending and foregone revenue as a percentage of GDP that they exceeded in putting money into their economies to deal with COVID. Small countries like Barbados can't do that, sir. And while dealing with COVID, we had our first hurricane in over 50 years. So what do we have to do? This government has committed to asking the IMF to reshape and retool the institutional architecture of the world financial system, sir. That is what the Bridgetown Initiative is about. And we are led, sir, by a astute global leader who has called on the world financial system to take 3 steps. That if they take those steps, we will be a long way to securing our ability to deal with the crises that are emerging in the world in which we live, sir. Step one, speaks about providing emergency liquidity to stop the debt crisis in its tracks. Because we understand the impact of these crises and how they're affecting small countries. As I said, sir, we can't pump money into the economy like the industrial powers of the world. Because we have developing, sir, two responses to the global crises. So much so that when the Americans were done, unemployment was back down to the pre-COVID levels and historic lows. And as a result of the overheating of the economy, the Fed started raising interest rates. Those are problems that big countries face. We don't have that latitude, sir. So what the government is saying is to the international world, a voice that is resonating, sir, mind you, provide some emergency liquidity to stop the debt crisis in its tracks. The second step, sir, we need to expand multilateral lending to governments. Governments cannot tax their way out of these crises that portend on the horizon, sir. But if we don't deal with being able to mitigate these crises, sir, we wipe out all the gains. And what the World Economic Forum report on global risk suggests, that countries are spending less and less in investing in human and social capital at the same time as these emergent crises resolve. So when we speak about transforming the economy, sir, it is a mission that we would have to start having a more intelligent conversation about in this country, because it cannot be government-led or government-driven. All sectors and players must be on the same page. And I hope none of the people on my side accuse me of letting out a secret. But Prime Minister Motley has said to us that even if it means that we do not reap the immediate gains of the transformation work that has to be undertaken, we will get credit for it later down the road. But we are committed to doing this transformation work now, because if we don't do it now, sir, it will be more difficult. And the problems that would arise that we have kicked down the road will come back to haunt us in a more severe way. So that only a couple of weeks ago, these two world leaders met, and the international environment played a significant role in their discussions. Particularly, they met at COP27, but they met recently, about 2 weeks ago, sir, to rekindle the relationship that became a little frosty after Brexit. And one of the things on the table is the Bridgetown Initiative. We're talking, sir, about the IMF returning its rapid financing facilities to COVID crisis levels, even after the pandemic has ended, sir. We're talking about temporarily suspending interest rate surcharges for heavy borrowing and rechanneling at least 30% of the unused special drawing rights, what we call SDRs in international economic law, to countries that do not have an international reserve currency. Countries like Barbados. And this is the approach. I should say this is the sales pitch. You finance global public goods, things that benefit everybody in the world. So we are not going with a begging bowl. We are saying, sir, that regardless of who we are, countries like Barbados have to mitigate against climate change and disaster and risk mitigation. These have to be financed, sir. Barbados cannot tax its way in a position where we can finance these things. So when we engage in international financial institutions, as Senator Dr. Monroe said, to reshape a Bretton Woods model of institutional capitalism that started in 1945 in the aftermath of a world war. We are not bluffing our way in the international world, but we are speaking from a perspective that this Prime Minister, who, like Mr. Arthur, sat in the parliament with the 4 Prime Ministers who preceded her as well, and brings to this country, sir, a budget about transformational change at this stage. And sir, I want to say a little bit of something about all of the criticism that we had about going to a republic And why is that important in this context? One of the things that you hear people say is, what does a Republican do for me? What does it mean? I even heard the sleeping giant come out and say that nobody in Barbados can tell you what is beneficial since we've become a republic. But sir, know that you can't go to the international community as one of the Queen's subjects and speak with authority as one of the Queen's subjects or as one of the King's subjects on these issues. The Prime Minister spoke in the budget, sir, about moving from short pants to long pants. And if a republic means, sir, that we have the psychological development in our own selves to project to the world with confidence who we are as a people and with an equal right to participate in global discourses, I think that the move to a republic was a timely one, if it should not have happened many years ago. We can leverage, sir, our head of state. But sir, I got to be careful because I don't know if we amended the standing orders, but the standing orders did prevent us, sir, from referring to Her Majesty or any of her children in these debates. I don't know. But we can...
It was more about of calling into conduct, calling into question the conduct.
The conduct of
yes. Or seeking to unduly mention them as a means of leverage to get your point. But a reference to the positive way is not outlawed.
Certainly, sir. But the soft power approach that we can use at the diplomatic level and that we have been using with our head of state being received as the personification of Barbadian excellence on a global stage is now something that is an ace up our sleeves. And the reports you hear in the international community about how our president has been received in African places where she's meant to represent this country, to break open conversations that we could not have had if we were still one of His Majesty's subjects, is an important part. So that link, sir, right? And that is important that we understand that the world took note that Little England became a republic. The only place you were hearing criticisms was what I call the professor that knows everything, because you know in politics you have these people that come up, they know everything, they speak on every subject. And they're experts on every subject. I call them, I don't know if they're here, but I call them professors in drag. That speak on every subject and they know everything. You know, sir, you're a cricketing man, and if I may make an analogy, sir.
There are none of them here, I take it, Senator.
Pardon me?
There are none of them here.
None of them, sir. None of them, sir.
Thank you very much.
No, speaking on every subject, sir. The people in here are experts in their field and they lend to the quality of the debates in this field. Huh? I don't deal with American nomenclatures. Well, I ain't one though. Sir, these criticisms, sir, of you drawing you out. All of a sudden, I can't be heard into perfect silence, but I'll move on, sir.
Just address the chair,
yes,
please.
Sir, and I made that comment, sir, about the nature of their conversation, sir. Masquerading as experts on every subject. And this country was told that we got it wrong, that we should not have gone to republic until we reformed the Constitution, and that's not always done. Like if that is the only way to do something. And all the prophecies, I mean, they don't ever shut up, but let them keep talking, let them keep talking. Because while they're talking, we're working, sir. We're working, but we hope, sir, to seriously engage Barbadian minds about the importance of the issues that face and confront this country. And the need, sir, to move on with the transformation of the Barbadian society and economy and its people for our benefit, sir. Sir, I say context is everything. And so last year, I came to this debate and themed my contribution on the building of a good society, sir. I hope that you will forgive me, sir, if you see me reverting to some of the concepts that I spoke to, but I did not necessarily get a chance to develop and go in depth. Last year, one of the fundamental pillars of the good society, sir, is the rule of law. And, sir, in recent times I've been driven to recognize that the law cannot rule if it can't protect. If a government leads a country that's aspiring to and building a good society, we must have laws in the country that benefit all of our people. People who come, visit these shores, people who live here, people who choose to come and move here, people who are born here, whose navel strings are buried right here. The role of law and justice in the good society cannot be underscored, Mr. President. I'm happy that in these estimates, the government has increased the contributions to ensure that the system of the administration of justice is not left like a distant second cousin to the other departments of government that have benefited from government resources and input and investment, sir. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to attract international investment. We're not going to be able to speak on the world stage with confidence. We're not going to be able to articulate our concerns if we do not have institutional support for a system of administrative justice and the administration of justice that is fair and that is equitable and is based on the rule of law. Sir, we have too many pre-colonial statutes or statutes from colonial times on our books. So it's embarrassing, sir, for us to have our courts continue to strike down laws that were placed there since the 1800s. And I know that the government is working assiduously to make sure that we can update the system of criminal justice in Barbados. So I have difficulties explaining to students why acts that are done by adults in the normal course of their business are considered criminal when they're done by children. And if anybody were to ever read the legislation that created the offense of wandering, that is the most abhorrent position to have as a society. And I digress to go into this here because I heard a lot of criticism in other places, sir, or some criticism. I read it that why the judge striking down this, we need to deal with wayward children. Wandering is not defined in a dictionary sense. Wandering is the perception of the court that the child's parents are not able to take care of it, or don't have any, as they use words in the statute, visible means of support. So that a magistrate looking at the way how the mother speaks or how the father behaves can make an immediate determination that this child has no visible means of support and can put that child in prison or in a facility that is a prison for 3 years. That has been the law in Barbados since the 1800s. And sir, this is so abhorrent to our sense of decency as a people. We need to know to look, sir, as we transform the economy, transform the society to become a society that is globally, a global society of standard bearer of global excellence, to deal with all these vagrancy laws. Because in law, we call them vagrancy laws because they were designed to control the movement and the ability of people to stray from the plantation is still on our books, where we take civil disobedience and turn it into criminal activity in this country, sir. We have a Market and Slaughterhouses Act, sir, that has criminalized wayside vendors in this country. Since the 1800s, it's still part of our act. And sir, as a youngster, sir, in the profession, I remember having to go to the magistrate's court to argue that selling in Bolton Lane behind Cape Shepherd was not in breach of the Market and Slaughterhouses Act because, one, the vendors down there were not selling meat, cold storage, or other materials, and other materials has to be interpreted within the context of the specific words that precede the general phrase other materials. And two, Bolton Lane was not within the curtilage and perimeters boundaries of the Fairchild Street Market or the Cheapside Market. Those are the two existing markets in the 1846 piece of legislation that was enacted. But the police were down there, I don't want to say harassing, but humbugging people, trying to make an honest living. And sir, thankfully, no government has sought to include the Palmetto Street Market within the schedule to that act. But sir, we still have laws that function in that way in our society. And this government, sir, has taken the bold step to outlaw or to remove from the statute books crime, selling, and selling goods to Barbadians as a criminal offense. But we have to do more, sir, to ensure that all of the things that we try to lock up people for in this society are revisited and to ensure that we are not making petty criminals of people who do ordinary things. Thirdly, I'm happy to report that the process of constitutional reform is going on apace. As the deputy chairman of that commission, sir, even today, we receive substantive contributions. And so we're not getting contributions only from stakeholder and interest sector groups, but Barbadians who have held high positions of state and in the office in this country are reflecting on their career paths and are making substantive contributions, and I thank them for it, sir, on behalf of the members of the commission. Because this exercise had to be depoliticized, because the constitution that we will create in our republic would not be the constitution that governs essentially what all of us will face living in the country. It governs the future of Barbados. And sir, this chamber will have the opportunity, I believe next month, to speak to the commission. And I know a number of the members of this chamber, sir, particularly the independents, have made a valid and valiant effort, led one, to speak about the importance of this second chamber in our democracy. I'm not going to say anything more, lest I be accused of trying to push my own view in the whole system. But we need to speak seriously, sir, as to whether or not this country deserves and can afford a full-time parliament, vested with the resources that are necessary for us to keep track, not only of what government is doing, but looking at the horizon and being able to speak truth to power on a local, regional, and international stages. So I don't believe that we are equipped. I mean, we come here, we do our own research, but certainly, if I may say, it is time for us to take seriously putting the institutional support behind the work that we do, so that whenever we are hearing the people speak on issues, whenever we consider constituency branches, people's assemblies, whatever we may call it, town hall meetings or so, when the legislation gets here, the level of probity is of such a standard that we can make laws that we are truly proud of. We can pass resolutions that we are truly proud of, and know that even if there is a divide on the methodology or in a particular stance that weighs heavily on a particular area or not, we know that it is only after the most careful deliberation that these laws have passed our chamber and go to Her Excellency for a say. Sir, Social Security reform is another big area that the government has on its bailiwick. And the government has come to this country honest, forthright, and diligent in its approach to dealing with the problems. We have not tried to cast blame on previous administration. We have said, look, this is the problem. These are the reasons that are exacerbating this problem, and let us get to fixing them, sir. We will soon have to consider the proposals to deal with the reform of our social security system, which has been an important plank in our development as a people, sir. So we have to admit and accept that there is a slowing of the birth rate in the country. There's a decline in the percentage of working people to the population and an increase in the dependents. So what does that mean? If the birth rate is slowing down and you have more dependents, it means that you have more people living after retirement, or people who have not contributed to the system directly, that are dependent on the system. There's no political blame to be shared in this demographic analysis. This is a problem. We hear people talking about importing people into the country. How will Barbadians deal with that phenomenon? We keep a lot of noise when they had people in the Caribbean that don't look particularly like us, or the majority of us, both here in Barbados a number of years ago. And we had the unenviable reputation, sir, of having a bench called after our Caribbean neighbors at the airport. And the last administration sir, took pride in penalizing somebody from the region for trying to come here. When we understand that 30% of the tourists who come here are from the region. That aside, sir, I want to address the level of contributions made by the various funds, and I'm not talking about the National Insurance Fund, but there are other funds, the injury benefit funds and those, sir. Because those two have an impact upon the ability of the NAS to manage the portfolio funds, sir. Personal injury compensation, sir, is a big issue for me. Because the national insurance is entitled to recover the money it pays the injured person in a car accident, where they have to be off work and they are paid an NIS payment because they are contributing to the fund. They're off work, so they get some money for lost wages. The NIS, sir, is entitled to recover the money paid to that contributor. But it does not always get that money because sometimes it's not claimed. I would like to think that we have to rework the regulations where any time a person is employed claiming, well, it can't be unemployed claiming benefits from the injury fund, have to be working. But it should be mandatory that where insurance claim is paid out, that those funds are returned to the NIS as something that is mandatory. I don't know if a practice direction has to be given or the NIS regulations have to be changed. I also believe that our QEH and our polyclinics have a right to be compensated for the medical care provided to persons who get into personal injury accidents, work-related accidents, car accidents also. I got a call yesterday by an old woman that got let down by a baggage car in the port through the negligence of the operator, and having to walk from where she was out the port because the view is that they were not sympathetic because she didn't look the right way. That aside, these kinds of injuries cost our health system significant amounts of money. If you go to a private doctor, the care that the private doctor provides and the cost of writing the report are compensated within the personal injury claim. And the QEH and the polyclinics have to be able to make claims there too. It is not a free service, sir. Employers are allowed under law to recover money that they give to their employees when the employees are off work. A simple legal principle of compensation. When public sector employees and state-owned enterprises, people who are employed there, in fact, it is the case for the state to be compensated for lost wages. While that employee is out sick, while that officer is out sick from an injury, is even greater because public workers are not insured for sickness benefits. As some statutory boards are not, the employees are not insured because the government will always pay the salary. So that government is paying that salary to the person who's out injured, the person is not at work, so no work is being done from that officer. Private sector people can claim that back. It is time that the government puts its house in order in that regard as well, sir. People who provide domestic assistance for injured persons can get compensation from an insurance company in a personal injury claim. We need to regulate the way in which that is done. I know the newspapers might say that Nichols asking for the insurance company to carry the premiums. But it's not fair, sir, for the state to be the only contributor to the recovery process of injured persons and is not getting its just due, just like the operators in the field in the private sector, sir. The insurance companies in Barbados must be required, sir, therefore, to notify the national insurance when a personal injury claim comes in, and the appropriate steps be taken to ensure that the contributions going out that are recoverable as a legal principle of compensation are recovered by the state as well. If we continue to leak out of the funds or take out of the funds of the national insurance system, the funds under its purview, without properly topping them back up, when contributions can be lawfully claimed to top them back up, we are only creating another problem down the road, sir. Sir, I also believe, and it is my submission, that we honestly have to revisit the standard. 5 minutes? Well, sir, I didn't get to. Sorry, you were begging for some said I'll use time, but you don't think you use all of his. But not aside, sir. I would want, sir, for us to revisit the standard, the medical standard at which people under the National Insurance Scheme are considered to be either invalids or disabled. Many a times, as you will see in cases, you are submitting a claim on behalf of a person in a matter in the courts, and the private doctors used by the insurance company, specialists in their field, are disputing the findings that the claimants are either disabled or invalids. I would not have considered him to be an invalid, to tell the court. The court has to make up its mind, but You hear the lawyer on the other side saying, well, sir, this man walking to the court and walking back out. But there's a report saying that this person is an invalid. And the state has to, national insurance has to pay that person for the balance of their life. And if they do get employment, because disabled people can work, they then have to repay the national insurance every cent that they have drawn during the period of their invalidity. And I echo this because I know Senator Boyce is working assiduously with that sectoral group to reform the process. But certainly, people who are injured or have chronic pain and injuries of that kind can work in other sectors in the Barbadian economy. And certainly, I don't think that we can reward in a way or be a disincentive for them to find work. Because once that work opportunity comes up and it's not sufficient to pay back NAS, they're not going to work. And they become a complete drain on the state for the rest of their lives. So these are the things that we have to reform. Sir, I would have wished, sir, to give my support to the ministry responsible for crime prevention, sir, in some of the initiatives in relation to reaching out to the sporting organizations to get initiatives out there in our communities to get young girls and boys playing sport. The Barbados Football Association has a Young Tridents program that is about to launch or has launched. And I have been asked in my capacity as the Secretary of Barbados Cricket Association to work with the Ministry of Crime Prevention to tailor a program called Second Chance, where we identify in the schools those children who the teachers feel are at risk of being lost to the system. And we are working with the Ministry of Crime Prevention to go into the schools, not the star players who are already the focus of the top coaches on the island and so, but to introduce as a second chance opportunity. Sir, there's a man who plays cricket for the West Indies to this day. He's not from Barbados, who was sent to Barbados at the Center of Excellence at UWI only because his superintendent knew somebody there. And he has made an international career for himself. I don't even call his name. But he never played cricket at all until he arrived in Barbados. But he's still in the West Indies team, or one of the West Indies teams. And that is an opportunity for us to introduce some wholesome activity within the young people's spheres of operation in this country, sir. So I close my contribution, sir, in wholeheartedly supporting the economic program of the government to transform this country over the next 7 years to a society of global excellence. I enjoin all Barbadians, sir, to continue to lift their voice, to ask questions, to ask searching questions, to engage in debates, to turn up to the town hall meetings, whatever facility that is created to lend your voice, even the calling programs. But let us agree that the process is not regime change. That cannot be the end goal of any right-thinking member of Barbados. Governments will change in Barbados. We've always changed governments. Both major political parties have held the reins of government equal times. And no government will last forever. But that cannot be the enduring, consistent, operative thought of the day. Building this society to be resilient, to be strong, to be a voice to be reckoned with, a voice on reparations and justice and equity and fairness in the world, sir. That is where we have to aspire to be. I thank you, sir, and I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this sitting of the Senate be suspended for the lunch break to reconvene at 5 minutes before 2 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 1:55 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore suspended until 1:55 p.m. today.